Hey everyone, welcome back from fall break. I hope you had a nice and relaxing week. I did very little, which was kind of nice, but got outside a little bit, so hopefully you all were able to do the same. Um, you can see there's some balloons in the background. My apologies. Hopefully they're not distracting. My daughter's birthday is like in a week and a half, but she couldn't have her birthday party. Um, at that time because the only people we can have over are the groups in our pod and blah, blah, blah. So we had to do it this weekend. So anyway, that's why the balloons are up and it's kind of festive. So we're just leaving them up for a while. All right. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about Western coniferous forests. The week before break, we talked about Angie versus Jim. So some of the important differences between angiosperms and gymnosperms. And now we'll start talking about forests dominated by these different functional groups. So we're going to start on the West Coast where the majority of the forests are dominated by conifers or gymnosperms. And then next week we'll talk about the Eastern deciduous where those are dominated by angiosperms. I'm going to talk about three examples of coniferous forest in the Western US. And as you kind of look at the Western part of North America in general, these three types of forest really kind of capture the majority of the forest cover types out there. Certainly there's variations on this, but these really capture the majority of what's dominating the landscape. So I'll talk about the boreal forest and some of the important aspects of that forest cover type, talk about temperate coniferous rainforests, and then I'll talk about the coniferous forest in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. So let's just get going. Let's see. Yeah, I forgot about this slide. So if you remember way back to the beginning of the class, we talked about ecoregions. And there's different levels of divisions of ecoregions. And if you remember, the four main domains the four main levels are domains, divisions, provinces, and sections. And so I'll give you some information on the ecoregion for each of the forests we're talking about. Again, nothing you have to know for a test or anything, just for you to be a little bit familiar with these, this classification scheme. So the four domains are polar domain, humid temperate, dry domain, and the humid tropical domain. And you can see in the US, we only have three of those domains. We don't have the polar domain. And what we'll be talking about today are primarily in this green, humid, temperate domain. And then we'll talk about the boreal forest, which is kind of getting up into that polar region. One other thing just about the forest cover types and thinking about the soil types. The major soil types where you find forests, at least in North America, are these three soil types: spotosols, ultisols, and andisols. And you can see them on the maps here. Here's the distribution of those three soil types. And so what you can see on the East Coast, especially the ultisols, are where we have lots of our eastern deciduous forest and some of those pine savannas we talked about. The andisols are really in the Pacific Northwest because these have volcanic ash in them. And so, our West Coast is in the Ring of Fire area where you've got all the volcanic activity around the Pacific. So there's a lot of volcanic ash there. Anyways, you're not going to have to know this, but I just give this as background information. And then thinking about the characteristics of these soil types that we're really going to focus on today, where the coniferous forests are, there's kind of three general characteristics that are associated with all of these soil types. They're slightly acidic, they tend to have low fertility, and they tend to be, coarse defined doesn't really give you a specific range. A lot of them are coarse. The volcanic areas are quite fine, but other than that, they generally are coarse soils. So in thinking about coniferous forests, we've talked about the gymnosperms as being stress tolerators. And so like being slightly acidic and low fertility, and especially coarse soils, those generally lead to kind of stressful conditions, whether that's nutrient limitations or water limitations. But those are the types of soils that are associated with the coniferous forest that we'll be talking about today. Okay, so let's start off by talking, we'll kind of move from the north to the south. We'll start off by talking about the boreal forest. The ecoregions are 130/131, so those are in the polar domain, and then M130 or M131. And remember, M just stands for it's mountainous. So the boreal forests are going to be found in that polar domain, so that tells us it's a really cold place, which you probably all know anyway. This is a map of the boreal forest from the Canadian Forest Service, or I don't remember what the Forest Service is called in Canada, to be honest. But I show this, I might have shown this before, but I like this one because it's kind of what the US would do if they were mapping the boreal forest. They'd cut Canada out. And so here Canada has just cut off their map right at Alaska and says, US, you can map your own boreal forests. But really what you see is it's this really broad band of vegetation across much of North America. And then if we look at the global map, you can just see that broad band of vegetation continues across all of Europe and Asia as well. So it's this band of vegetation that circumvents the globe and is a really large kind of forest cover type. So you can see at the bottom, boreal forests cover about 17% of Earth's terrestrial surface. And here's that pie chart that we have looked at before. And you can see the desert ecosystems are the only ecosystems that cover a larger proportion of or percentage of Earth's surface than the boreal forest. So it's a really large forest cover type that covers much of the northern part of the world. And interestingly, I might say this again, it's not super important to what I'm going to say, but the vegetation type doesn't actually change that much across the boreal forest. It seems that, when you're talking about dealing with extreme cold temperatures and all that goes along with that, short growing seasons, cold temperatures, all that kind of stuff, it seems like there's fewer species evolved to adapt and deal with those conditions well. And so we have less diversity of the plant species across the boreal forest. So a lot of the species that dominate the boreal forest in Alaska dominate the boreal forest all around the world. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why evergreen gymnosperms dominate the boreal forest. Why aren't there more deciduous trees on the landscape here? And it's really all about temperature, and that's going to be the kind of the theme for the boreal forest in particular, is all of the different aspects of ecosystem function that temperature kind of controls and modulates. So we're really thinking about how cold it gets and a plant's ability to deal with cold temperatures, and how a plant can grow in a really short growing season. So growing season length, you can see how short it is. We're talking a few months long, really, in general, and maybe less than that in lots of places. The snow cover is from mid-October to mid-April, so it doesn't give you a lot of time in between to grow. Winter precipitation is often less than 100 millimeters. So you can see, if you look at the precip diagram here, that it does get most of its precip in the summer to late summer months, and very little in the winter. So really, a lot of times it's the winter snowpack that recharges the soil for plants that grow in the spring. And these systems, at least the ones in North America, don't really have that. So they're really relying in large part on the growing season precip. And let me just go back to this real quick, the cold temperatures in the growing season. We talked about this in the Angie versus Jim lecture. I'll just briefly touch on it, is that, these plants have the ability to maintain function under cold temperatures because of the small diameter vessels. So they don't experience much cavitation due to freezing. So that allows them to keep functioning even when temperatures are dropping below zero. And then because they're evergreen, they do well with that short growing season, because Remember, gymnosperms are, they have lower photosynthetic rates, but they can maintain those photosynthetic rates at colder temperatures. So since this is a fairly cold place, those species can maintain photosynthesis longer than angiosperms would be able to due to the cold temperatures. So those are the two main things. Another aspect that we'll talk about a decent amount with the boreal forest is the permafrost layer that occurs in this area. So here's just a few pictures of what the permafrost is. It's just a layer of ice underneath the soil surface. And it can vary a lot in how thick the permafrost layer is and how deep it is. Sometimes it's right below the soil surface, and sometimes it's, you know, several meters down. But if you could look at these pictures just to see that it can be a really significant layer. If you see in this top picture, you can see an individual standing here, and then how many times kind of thicker the permafrost layer is than this person is tall. So if that person were maybe 6 foot, part of his body's cut off, but you know, this might be close to 15 or 18 feet thick. So it can be a really significant layer of ice below the soil surface. These pictures certainly aren't the boreal forest, but they show kind of the impact that the permafrost layer has. So you'll see pictures like this from the tundra. There's some really cool photos out there. There's a few photographers that kind of specialize in aerial photography in the tundra, and they show this kind of pattern of the soil kind of being ripped apart as that permafrost layer freezes and thaws because that water is expanding and contracting. So much like freezing temperatures can do a lot of damage to roads because of that freezing and thawing, same thing in the alpine here. As it freezes and thaws underneath the soil, it kind of rips apart those shallower layers above it, and you get these kind of unique patterns. So again, this is not the boreal forest, but it just kind of shows that movement of the permafrost and the impact it might have on an ecosystem. So there are three main functions that we'll talk about the permafrost kind of playing or having in the boreal forest. And those are really, they kind of act like a bed, or the permafrost layer acts like a bedrock layer. So you've got this ice below the soil surface, and that's going to prevent roots from growing deeper than whatever that permafrost layer is. So let's say it's 1 meter down, then roots only have, you know, a meter of soil to explore, and they can't get below that. Also, water can't get through that permafrost layer, so it prevents infiltration, and that water is going to stay in the shallow layers. A lot of times it has saturated kind of bog-like conditions when there's lots of moisture. And then lastly, that permafrost layer, actually within the permafrost layer, it locks away a lot of organic material. And then it just keeps the soil temperatures really cold around the permafrost layer, slowing decomposition. So really it just locks away a lot of organic material and prevents it from decomposing. So those are the three major kind of roles of the permafrost layer that we'll be talking about today. All right, let's talk a little bit about this permafrost layer, how it develops, and how it's maintained. One of the major reasons we have the development of a permafrost layer is because there's a very thick organic layer on the forest floor of boreal forests. So a lot of times it can be around 100 centimeters thick, or a meter, so that's a little over 3 feet. I've seen situations where it's even deeper than that. So you've got 3 feet of like litter built up on top of the mineral soil surface, and that acts as a huge insulator. So what it does, so you can think about it in the boreal forest as like a cooler, right? You've got ice in the cooler, and if you've got really nice thick insulation, that ice is gonna stay ice longer and not melt as quickly. So we have kind of a similar thing here, is that this layer, this organic layer on top, prevents the soil from warming up in the summer and allows it to get really cold in the wintertime. So you need a prerequisite for the development of a permafrost is this thick organic layer. And that organic layer is there because litter quality is really poor and temperatures are really cold. So decomposition is really slow. And so as branches drop, as leaves are senesced, it just continually builds up, and it's not decomposing at a rate fast enough to keep up with that senescent. senescence. You don't have to do that. That was from when we were in class doing things. So here's just a couple examples of data associated with the organic layer. So if you look on the x-axis of both of these figures, we've got organic matter depth. So on the far left axis would be where there's no organic layer, and then it gets thicker and thicker as you move to the right. On the upper figure, you have mineral soil temperature. And what you see is the thicker the organic layer, the colder the mineral soil is. So it's keeping those temperatures really cold, and they can't warm up as much without that heating from solar energy. It also has an impact on soil moisture. So here's the soil moisture of that mineral soil. And again, the x-axis is the organic matter depth. So the thicker the organic layer, the more moisture is in the soil because it doesn't evaporate off. And so it stays in the soil where plants can actually utilize it. So you can see the importance of this organic layer. So this is just a summary of kind of the permafrost, its development, and then the function that it supplies in this ecosystem. And we'll come back and talk a little more about the permafrost and that organic layer here in a few minutes. The permafrost layer is really important. I guess this relates to the decomposition rate, but it's kind of like an ecosystem service, that because of this permafrost layer locking away organic material, the boreal forest stores lots of carbon. And it's not just the permafrost layer, it's also because of the colder temperatures and slow decomposition rates. But that permafrost layer really has a huge impact on the ability of these forests to store carbon. So you can see the amount of carbon for these different forest cover types. Boreal forest stores twice what a tropical forest would, and almost 7 times what a temperate forest would. And part of this is that the biome is so large, so that definitely contributes to it, but a much bigger impact is just how much is stored and locked away due to the permafrost and those cold temperatures. Okay, I have some slides in here that again, we kind of did these in class, we did these in class. So I'm not going to stop the video, you can do that. But these are good prompts for you to do in thinking about studying and preparing for the exam. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the vegetation and the flora in the boreal forest. There's kind of 4 main subdivisions of different vegetation types. You've got river floodplains, you have early succession, late succession, and mature forests. And within the mature forests, we have uplands with permafrost and uplands without permafrost, and kind of have different vegetation types dominating each of these. So first let's talk about the river floodplains and kind of the early successional forest. And these are really dominated by willows and alders. So they tend to be shrubbier systems, although willows and alders can be trees. These areas are disturbed frequently enough that they don't usually have kind of mature trees dominating them. It stays in this kind of shrubby state. So you can see a couple pictures here, the black and white one here of these willows and alder regenerating after a flooding event, and here a color photo, and all this short vegetation on the other side of that river is willows, or the majority of it is willows and alders. And so both of these species are really good they're kind of like pioneer species, right? They can occupy and dominate an ecosystem really quickly. So that was river floodplains and early succession. If you look here, I've also got late succession forests, which we're not going to talk in great detail about, but what I will say is that well, I guess I will. Okay. Sorry, I forgot I had this divided this way. So in our upland forests, which are not in that kind of flood zone of the rivers, we have late successional stage species. And this is interesting. You notice that all of these are deciduous angiosperms. So our late successional plants are not evergreen gymnosperms, but they are deciduous plants. And they all just have the ability to grow super, super fast. So there's a short growing season, and these plants cannot grow well when it's cold, but they can grow so fast when the conditions are good that they're able to occupy these sites. And you can see I've got them listed by the kind of habitat they tend to occupy. Then in our mature forest species, or really for the most of boreal forests, we're talking about white spruce and black spruce. And the thing you really need to remember about these two species is white spruce dominate areas that don't have permafrost, and black spruce dominate areas that do have permafrost. And often, if there's no disturbance, the white spruce will eventually be replaced by black spruce, and that would be the dominant species. But most of the time, we have a mix of those two species. And then there are areas, really wet areas, that are going to be dominated by Alaskan larch. So especially in Alaska, near like the fjords and the waterways is where Alaskan larch dominates. And as you move inland, you don't have as much Alaskan larch. And basically anywhere that's warm enough, you're going to have quaking aspen dominating, much like we do in the Rockies here. The interesting thing is that we've got pretty much 6 tree species that dominate the boreal forest. And again, that's across like all the world. That's not just in Alaska or not just in Canada. That's pretty much everywhere. You've got primarily these 6 species. So you've got very few vascular species providing biodiversity in these landscapes, but the biodiversity really comes from the mosses and lichens. So there's a huge number of species, both that grow in the forest canopy and on the ground, of mosses and lichens in these functional groups. So that's where our biodiversity of the flora really comes from in the boreal forest. And that's what you see a lot of this litter layer on the forest floors from those mosses and lichens. That's such a cool picture, isn't it? I want to go hiking there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about management and conservation of the boreal forest. This is a zone with lots of changes going on due to changes in our climate. And so lots of things to be thinking about, and that are kind of hot topics from thinking about management and conservation. So the figure I have here is basically just growing season length. So on the y-axis, it's number of frost-free days. So again, kind of growing season length. And here's year going back to almost 1900 and ending, I think, 2005 or 2004, somewhere in there. And you can see this really, oh, here it is in my title, 2008. So you can see this really strong increase in growing season length over the last 100 years in the boreal forest. So big changes to, species that are used to adapted to these really short growing seasons. Now, if you look back at 1900 compared to now, we've got over like almost 40 days more, something like that, certainly more than a month of an extra growing season. That's a big change. So we've got warmer temperatures, more frost-free days, and these are having an impact on a lot of kind of ecosystem functions in the boreal forest. So one, we're seeing increases in fire activity and fire intensity. We're seeing changes in the permafrost layer. It's thinning, it's melting. Big changes in hydrology and insect outbreaks. So I'll just touch on a few of these, show you some data and some pictures associated with them. So the first one is fire. There's been a lot of studies looking at fire frequency and intensity in the boreal forest, and there's definitely evidence that it has been increasing, especially over the last century, but even over the last kind of 10,000 years or so, there's been this gradual increase in fire intensity and frequency. These forests are really flammable, especially in a dry season when fires tend to occur. But these trees can really dry out, and then you have the mosses and lichens growing in the canopy. And when those dry out, they just really help the fire carry through the forest canopy. And mostly what we're seeing is late season fires. So not an increase in like spring fires or anything, but more in the kind of fall, late summer, fall conditions. And I should go back, let me say this real quick about these late season fires. I showed that figure on growing season length. What tends to be happening is that those longer growing seasons, the plants use all of the water up in their, in a relatively short period of time. And so what we're seeing is those trees are drier, are kind of experiencing more drought-like conditions because of the length of the growing season. So they use up all their soil moisture, but it's still warm out. And so they dry out, they get drought stressed, and everything dries out more. and then it's more susceptible to fires. Whereas if we had a month less of a growing season, they wouldn't hit that really dry period, and we probably wouldn't see the same number of fires. So that's the connection that scientists have made between fire frequency and growing season length. This is a picture after a fire. And you can see these kind of brown patches here. That's what's left of the organic layer. All right, so remember, we've got a pretty thick organic layer. This one is maybe 30 centimeters or so. You can see lots of bare soil, mineral soil, and then these patches of mineral soil, or sorry, of organic layer. So what's happening is as fires increase in intensity, they are burning off more of the organic layer than we think they used to. So what that does is exposes the bare mineral soil. When that bare mineral soil is exposed, it doesn't have that insulating effect. So in the summer months, the temperatures are going to actually warm up more in the soil and melt that permafrost layer. Because remember, that organic layer is helping keep it cold even in the summer months. So without that, it's going to warm up even more. And especially, we don't have a forest canopy to keep it cold either. So that removal of the organic layer is having a big impact on permafrost melting. And here's just an example of the temperatures that are experienced in the soil with and without organic layer. So we've got several different soil types. So at the top, we've got these rocky uplands, silty uplands, and sandy lowlands. And then we've got surface temperature, which I think it will tell you, is at 5 centimeters, and then deep temperatures at 100 centimeters. So I'm just focusing on this box right here. And we've got two lines here representing soil temperatures. The dotted line is the burned, and the solid line is an unburned. And these sites are really close together. So the difference between these isn't because one's in a colder place and one's in a warmer place. They're very similar conditions. The difference is that this dotted line, which is a burned site, that organic layer was removed during that fire. And here it hasn't been removed. So what you really notice is if you look at the summer temperatures, so this is kind of a little bit backward, where winter is in the middle of the x-axis, so January, February, March here in the middle. So if you look in the summer temperatures, you can see the temperatures never get above zero. And that's because of that organic layer and the permafrost layer working together to keep those temperatures cold. But if you burn and remove that organic layer, you can see that temperatures are warming up several degrees above zero. And that's at a meter down. So that's going to start melting that permafrost layer. So that's kind of this relationship between permafrost layer and fires are kind of, we're having more fires, removing organic layer, starting to melt permafrost. And that's contributing then to this release of CO2 that's going on from the boreal forest. And so conceptually what's happening is that before a fire, the active layer might be something like, this is just an example, might be like 3.3 meters in this particular example, which is like 10 feet. So that means the permafrost layer would be below this dotted line, and roots could access this upper soil. There'd be soil moisture in there. But as the permafrost layers start to melt, you have this larger active layer. So in this particular example, it might move down to 5.9 meters. So that's more like, I don't know, like 16, 17 feet, somewhere in there. And so you've got a lot more ability of the roots to explore more area, but also the microbes can explore more soil and decompose all of the organic material that used to be locked away in this layer, and they can release that carbon then as CO2. And so we're seeing this increase in respiration rates and CO2 release due to this melting permafrost layer. This is just one particular study kind of highlighting this increase in fires, and this one in particular is over a long period of time, the last 10,000 years. Another aspect is increased insect outbreaks. This just shows the infestation of spruce beetle in two different time periods, so from 72 to 85 and then 85 to 98. So this is a really kind of outdated publication, but you can even see then in this time period an increase in the outbreak of spruce beetle. maybe you've taken a class from Seth Davis and talking about life cycles of the insects, but essentially that longer growing season length and warmer temperatures lead to greater population growth of the insects, leading to the potential, of a bigger impact and disturbance due to the insect attacks on trees. And then lastly, with these warmer temperatures and longer growing season, seeing a lot of open bodies of water that are just disappearing. So you can see pictures from 1951 compared to 2000 and the size of this lake and how it's really shrunk and gotten a lot smaller. And this is just two different examples. So it has a big impact on the hydrology, wildlife habitat, water availability for plants on the landscape. So really big changes in the boreal forest. All right, so here's just a summary of questions that you can think through yourself. Again, helping you think through information that might be on the exam. I'm going to take a short break and then I'll come back and we'll talk about the temperate coniferous rainforests. Okay, now let's shift focus and talk about the temperate coniferous rainforest. And this forest really covers much of the western part of North America. So the boreal forest, starts to transition, once you get south of Alaska, really we start to transition more into this temperate coniferous rainforest. It goes all the way through Canada and down through the Cascade Range in Washington, Oregon, and the northern part of California. So really large areas covered by the temperate coniferous rainforest in the western part of the US and North America in general. And I love talking about this area, I guess, because I had the opportunity to work and live in Oregon for a number of years, and we worked a lot in the temperate coniferous rainforest, and just like such a beautiful, amazing, lush place to be. It's kind of fun to talk about and remember being there. So let's move forward. So here's just a couple pictures, examples of what the forest canopy and the understory looks like. Some of the things we'll talk about in this section, things that this area is known for, is carbon storage, the amount of carbon storage, especially above ground, and that contrasts with the boreal forest where lots of the carbon storage was below ground. The size of the trees, the structure of the forest canopy, moss and lichen diversity, and we'll talk specifically about old growth forests just a little bit at the end. So here's just a picture. This is an area that I spent a lot of time working while I was there. So another grad student and I constructed this tower that you can see. And we have sensors on this tower to measure CO2 concentrations. And what we were trying to do is that in this particular region, the landscape is fairly steep slopes, but very distinct watersheds. So what happens at night is as the air cools, the air like drains down these watersheds just like water would. So we called them air sheds. And as that water drains down and out the bottom of the air shed, we could measure the CO2 concentration, get an idea of how much respiration was going on in the forest to give us an idea of the functioning. We couldn't measure growth, but it was a way to get an idea of the function of these forests. So spent many a day and night because we sampled all night long, and so we would sleep out here and have to wake up every couple hours and collect samples. So that part wasn't very fun, but it's a great place to work. One other thing just to know about this region in particular is just the logging history is such a strong part of the history of not only these forests, but the whole region. It's still, there's still towns that are kind of considered logging towns, but there's also a lot of towns where the logging industry, the logging industry is much smaller than it was. And so those towns economically are quite depressed now. So it just has a legacy effect on the kind of culture and the economics of this whole region. So just highlighting that here with a few photos, and also starts to give you an idea of the size of some of these individual trees that are growing, or at least grew, on the landscape. All right, so let's talk about a couple things related a bit to carbon storage. So the two things we're going to talk about here is kind of why conifers dominate the Pacific Northwest, and we'll talk about the above ground carbon storage. The paper you have to read for this week is related to why conifers dominate the Pacific Northwest. And so I'll go into a little more detail on some aspects, but I won't cover all of the aspects that are in that paper. And I think I mentioned this before, that it seems like this should be an easy thing to answer, is why conifers are dominating this area. But actually the conditions are such that we'd actually expect deciduous angiosperms to be dominating this area. And instead we have conifers. And so it's been a question for a while that still isn't really answered. That paper gives some good reasons why we think the evergreen forests dominate this area. But it turns out when people do modeling simulations of tree growth to see what trees do best, turns out that the deciduous angiosperms still do best in the models. And that just tells us that we're missing something about the functioning of these ecosystems. Because if it's not in the model, it means we don't understand it. And the fact that the models are telling us angiosperms should be here just means we're missing something. So there's more to this story, but through what I'm going to talk about in the paper, you'll have a large portion of the story. All right, so the reason really that gymnosperms are dominating the Pacific Northwest is going to come down to timing of precip, and associated with that, timing of nutrient release. So you've seen these figures before, so I'll try to keep this short. But if you look at the annual statistics of climate, that's mean annual temperature, mean annual precip, you'll see the Cascades here in the Pacific Northwest on the left are warmer than the eastern deciduous forest and get more precip. We've talked about angiosperms. We've talked about they need, a good number of months of warm temperatures to grow. They need lots of moisture. And so on an annual basis, the Cascades actually looks better for their growth. But we've talked before about this dip in precip that occurs in the summer. Because it's a Mediterranean climate, it's wet winters, dry summer. And those dry summers lead to very little soil moisture in the soil, especially kind of mid to late summer. And those drought conditions kind of exclude deciduous angiosperms, which are not as drought tolerant, from dominating these areas. And it favors the gymnosperms, which again have the small tracheids to conduct water, and they're more resistant to cavitation due to drought, and they just grow better during this time, that summertime conditions. So that's one reason, is that timing of precip and the drought conditions that occur in the summer in the West Coast, but not on the East Coast, like this figure on the right shows, where in the East Coast it gets a majority of its precip during the summer months when the plants are actively growing. So that favors deciduous angiosperms more. Okay, so you can just see the stat about 10% of precip falling during the growing season. And we've talked about this as well, but why? This is the January kind of weather patterns. We've got this high pressure system, we've got the low pressure system that's off the west coast of the US. Low pressure systems are associated with cloudy skies and precip. And what happens is this low pressure system tends to, I think of it as like slinging its moisture onto the west coast. It kind of, because it's off the west coast, but the west coast is picking up a lot of the moisture from this low pressure system. But that's replaced by a high pressure system in the summer months, leading to the really clear skies and very little precip. So that shifting of the high and low pressure systems drive the climate of this region and contributes to why it's dominated by gymnosperms rather than deciduous angiosperms. Some of the dominant gymnosperms in this region are Douglas fir. So you all are probably familiar with Douglas fir in the Rocky Mountains, but I tell you what, the Douglas fir in the West Coast, they're a different subspecies and they reach sizes that you've never seen here in the Rockies. Huge, huge individuals. Western red cedar and western hemlock, those are the giants. So this picture in the upper left, where you can see this individual in the size of this tree, this is a red cedar. So those are the two species that are a little more shade tolerant, and they grow slower, but then once the Douglas fir in particular die off, then they are the canopy dominant species and they grow huge. And then you've got some areas with ponderosa pine and grand white and silver fir, and some of these can get quite large as well. Okay, now let's go back and talk about why the evergreens are here. Um, we talked about the timing of precip leading to those drought conditions in the summer. The other thing is what's going on in the time of year where we don't really think of growing conditions, and that's those winters. So winters are extremely wet and cloudy, very much a stereotype of the Pacific Northwest, right? And here you can just see some data on the number of cloudy days in the Pacific Northwest in the winters. So if you look at like January, February, or December, you can see that over 90% of the days have at least some cloud cover. And you can see that more than 60% of the days have some precipitation. So lots of precip, and even when it's not raining, there's very little sunlight to dry out things. It just stays wet and soggy all the time. Also, what's going on during the winter months is it's fairly mild conditions. And unless you get really, really high elevation, the temperatures are cold, but it's relatively mild for a lot of this region. So you have wet conditions with mild temperatures. What that leads to is decomposition rates. They're slow because of the cold temperatures, but that's when the moisture occurs, is in the winter months. So that's when the majority of decomposition is occurring. So here's just a figure showing when the amount of decay occurs. So this is percent weight loss of leaves. So they did an experiment much like we're doing in class with Douglas fir needles. And you they did this with different treatments. You don't have to worry about that. Just look at the control in the first and second years. You can see this hashed line here. That represents the percentage of decomposition that occurs in the winter, and the solid black portion represents how much occurs in summer. You can see that by far and away, the vast majority of decomposition is happening in the winter, very little in the summer because that's when it's really dry. What this means is that the nutrients that are being released during decomposition, those are released in the winter time. So if you are a tree or a plant that wants to take up as many nutrients as possible, the best time to do it is be in the winter. Now, deciduous angiosperms, because they're leafless in the winter time, they're very inactive. So they really can't take up nutrients very well in the winter time. Whereas the evergreens, if it's a moderately warm day, they can do a lot of nutrient absorption and take up those nutrients available in the winter and then use them during those summer months because their leaves are evergreen. They're staying around all year long. So they can use those nutrients, get ready to build new leaves, build those new leaves in the summertime and use them for growth. If deciduous angiosperms were dominating this area, lots of those nutrients would go unused and kind of wasted, so to speak. So timing of precip as far as drought goes, and timing of nutrient availability, which also has to do with the timing of precipitation. So those two factors are the primary drivers of why we have gymnosperms, evergreen gymnosperms dominating this area. Like I said, there's a little more to the story that we don't know yet, but those are part of it. Okay, so this is just summarizing kind of what I just said in different words. Okay, so that's why evergreen gymnosperms dominate the area. Now let's talk about the amount of carbon that these forests store and why that is. And there's two reasons for this. So we're going to talk about size of individuals and above ground carbon storage. So the trees in the temperate coniferous rainforest are known for being massive. And again, this kind of goes from Northern California up through Oregon, Washington, and large parts of Canada as well, where we have these huge individuals dominating the landscape. Many individuals are more than a meter in diameter, and they can be several meters in diameter, and 80 meters tall or more. So really tall, really large stems. And this is one of the only two regions in the world that have plants this size. On the west coast of Australia in Perth, which is in the bottom left corner kind of Australia, there's an area where eucalypts reach similar sizes to the conifers. So another area with huge trees. And those are really the only two places in the world where we get trees of this size. So this temperate coniferous rainforest in the US is really unique in that aspect. One of the reasons why the trees can attain these sizes is because we don't have the windstorms on the west coast like you do on the east coast. Certainly there can be windy conditions, and there was a windstorm that actually blew over a willow into our house at one point when we lived there. So there certainly are windy conditions, but not like on the east coast. And so the plants that have grown there have adapted to grow taller and taller because they're not going to get trimmed off by these windstorms like they would on the east coast. So that has led to really tall, big trees dominating the west coast. That leads to carbon storage because there's just a ton of carbon locked away in the above ground tissue, mainly in the bole of those trees. The diameter and the height of them just has a lot of carbon locked away. So that's one reason we have lots of above ground storage in these forests and more than other places. So here's just an example of standing above ground biomass in the Pacific Northwest versus a temperate deciduous forest on the East Coast. You can see there's about twice as much carbon locked away, or this is biomass, but it's about equivalent to carbon, about twice as much locked away in the living tissue of these forests compared to an eastern deciduous forest. Now, what's interesting and important to know is that it's not that it's growing faster. These forests grow at very similar rates. It's just because the trees can live longer and attain greater heights that there's more carbon standing above ground. The other thing that's contributing to the carbon storage is how much is in the coarse woody debris. So there's really large amounts of coarse wood sitting on the forest floor of the temperate coniferous rainforest. You can see here like about 6 times the amount of carbon is in coarse woody debris in the Cascade Mountain Range versus the eastern deciduous forest. So lots on the standing above ground biomass and a lot more on the forest floor leads to a lot more carbon storage in these forests above ground than many other forest cover types. The reason that we have so much coarse woody debris is because the rates of decomposition are relatively slow. So remember, I talked about the majority of decomposition in these forests occur in the winter months. So that's when it's wet, and that's when the majority of decomposition happens. But because it's cooler when it's wet, decomposition rates are pretty slow. In addition, because these forests are dominated by evergreen gymnosperms with poor litter quality, that also slows the rate down. So we end up with really slow rates of decomposition that leaves like large chunks of wood on the landscape, locking away that carbon more so than other forest cover types. Here's just an example. We've talked about litter quality a bit, but here's another example. This is lignin concentration versus annual litter mass loss. So again, they got this annual litter mass loss, much like we are doing our studies, but then they also analyze the lignin concentration. And so what you see, plants that have lots of lignin have slow decomposition rates. And lignin is what the cell walls of vessel elements and tracheids are made out of. So if you look at a comparison of angiosperms to gymnosperms in the percent lignin, which is this panel right here, you can see that on average gymnosperms have much higher concentrations of lignin than angiosperms do. So that poor litter quality slows down decomposition in addition to those cooler temperatures, leading to lots of coarse woody debris. Okay, let's talk briefly about some management issues in the Pacific Northwest. So this is where I'm definitely might be wrong on this, but for me, the term ecological forestry, like that really, I was introduced to it in the Pacific Northwest, and I think that's generally where it's I guess where it originated. I can't remember who originated it, but I think it was actually Jerry Franklin, who is a really well-known forester, forest ecologist with the Forest Service in the Pacific Northwest. So that's kind of where that term, I think where that term originated. And that's something we think about and associated with the management of forests Old growth forests are a big issue in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, everywhere, right? But I think they're maybe it's just me, but I feel like the conversation on old growth forests is a little more um, public, maybe, or well known among people in the Pacific Northwest. And I think that might be just because of the size of those trees. And when you remove those trees and you don't see any that big on the landscape anymore, you really notice the difference between an old growth forest and something that's not an old growth forest. And then the spotted owl habitat we'll talk about briefly as well. One thing that's interesting about the Pacific Northwest forest that I've kind of alluded to already is kind of where the timber production is coming from. So here's, this is just a figure showing the number of billions of board feet coming out of different types of forests, different ownership, I should say. So the federal land is orange, and then these green ones are private forest land. What you can see is that in the late 80s, there was still a large amount of timber coming out of national forests, but that dropped precipitously over the late 80s and early 90s, and as it really is at a pretty low rate now. Whereas you can see the amount of timber coming from private forest land has stayed relatively constant. So that's been a big change in why you can imagine like the timber industry has really felt the impact of this loss of timber coming off of those national forests. What's interesting about the Pacific Northwest is, a lot of those private forest lands behave somewhat like a national forest land or public land. They allow a lot of recreation on there. There's hiking trails and mountain biking trails on a lot of the private forested land. And so they kind of provide some of the same services the national forest does, but then they are also producing timber as well. So it's been a big change in the landscape over the last 30 years or so. One thing that's unique about the canopy structure of the Pacific North or of the temperate coniferous rainforest is the heterogeneity of the landscape. Some places the forest canopy is relatively uniform as you move across looking at height and age structure, but that's really diverse in these forests. So big gaps with shorter trees and younger trees, and then these really big, tall, old trees sticking up. And that heterogeneity is really, really important to one, the habitat that it provides, and so it's going to have an impact on wildlife. Also, there's some evidence that it leads to greater resilience of these forests. And so having that heterogeneous canopy makes them more actually resistant and resilient to different types of disturbance. And as that research has become more and more prevalent and clear, the management of these forests has led to, or has moved in the direction of trying to recreate these heterogeneous canopies. And that's where I think this term of ecological forestry kind of originated, and that they're trying to mimic the ecology of these complex forest canopies to create resilient forests that still would produce timber products. So this is just a couple pictures of kind of the heterogeneity and the size of the different trees. Here's a canopy crane. So there's a few of these canopy cranes around the world where you can actually access and do research on the tops of these old growth trees. Man, I was so lucky to be able to go up in this a few times and kind of travel up and down through the forest canopy, and you can really get a sense for that heterogeneity and the different gap sizes and stuff that occur in this area. And then lastly, the northern spotted owl. This has been like an issue going on for a really long time. So the northern spotted owl only nests in old growth forests. So they need, I shouldn't say only, they strongly prefer the old growth forests. And so without those, that canopy heterogeneity, they don't really nest there. And so the populations have declined. And from before, when I worked out there, I don't know, almost 20 years ago, they were working on spotted owl and changing a lot of the management practices to try to rehabilitate the population. My understanding is it still hasn't bounced back. And why that is, I'm not sure. But it's something that's still going on and still an issue and an important kind of part of developing management plans in the Pacific Northwest. Okay, that's all I have on the on the temperate coniferous forests. Here's again a few questions that you can ask yourself that will help you kind of prepare and get the major topics from what I just talked about. So again, I'm going to take a little break. We'll come back and we'll talk about the forests in California, and then that will be it for the western forests. For the last part of the western forests, we're going to talk pretty briefly about forests of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. And the reason that we're going to talk less about it is I feel like I've struggled more to consolidate the information from these forests. And I'm not sure, there's a lot of great research that's going on in these forests. So I know it's there. I don't know, I've just struggled a little more putting this section together with a kind of I feel like there's a bit of a story for the other forests, and here I don't feel like I've nailed that very well. So it's a little bit shorter. So these are both in the 200 domain, so M200s. So we're talking about mountainous conditions in the forest cover types there. So here's on the top left is a digital elevation map of California, and you can see this big hump in the middle. That's the Sierra Nevadas. So going to have huge differences in elevation and climate. You can see on this other picture here on the right, I'm tilting my head to look at it like horizontally. You can see the differences in precipitation that occur and how that's you can kind of line it up with that digital elevation map and see how important elevation is in driving precip. So orographic effect is huge and really the driver of differences in precipitation and forest cover types in the Sierra Nevadas. I was going to say one other thing. I guess I forgot already. One thing to keep in mind is that, like the temperate coniferous forests we talked about just a second ago, these are still forests that are in a Mediterranean climate. So it's going to be dry summers for these forests as well. And so still dominated by evergreen gymnosperms and still dealing with dry summer conditions and kind of drought conditions. The one thing I did want to say is that what's kind of unique, so I don't know why I do this, but I kind of compare the Sierra Nevadas a lot to the Rocky Mountains. And I think there's very distinct vegetation bands in the Sierra Nevadas like the Rocky Mountains. There's other similarities, at least in my mind. But one thing that's kind of unique about the Sierra Nevadas is the distance that you go from, or the distance you travel to go from one climate zone to another is really short compared to the Rockies. So that happens fairly quickly even in the Rockies, but it's much more drastic in the Sierra Nevadas. And so those bands of different precip and vegetation are really, really distinct, and there's more of them in the Sierras than we have in the Rockies. So it's a little bit different, a little more complex, I guess, than the Rockies. Complex probably isn't the right word. Okay, so now here's just general vegetation patterns in the Sierra Nevadas, and it doesn't match up perfectly with climate, but pretty much matches up with that precip diagram that I just showed you, moving from the grasslands in the foothills up to different forest cover types that we'll talk about at the peaks, and then down through some of those same ecosystem types and some different ones on the on the east side of the Sierra Nevadas. Another thing that's really unique about this region is the diversity of pine species. And so we're specifically talking about species in the Pinus genus and the pine family in general. So 53% of the pine species in North America are found in this region, and 15 of the 17 genera in the pine family are found in this region as well. So most of our kind of pine species occur in this small kind of area of North America. So just this California region. So it's a really diverse area for pines, and it's known globally for that. Okay, so just moving on to the vegetation patterns a little bit. If you take an NR220, you talk about these bands of vegetation at different elevations, and a lot of these should look familiar to you. So here's just a picture of some of these. On the west side, we're going to move from the west side up and over and talk about some of these vegetation types, and then we'll contrast them to the Rocky Mountains a little bit. So on the west side, in the Central Valley of California, you've got primarily grasslands and chaparral. So here's a picture of the chaparral, which are shrub-dominated ecosystems. And then we've got some grasslands moving into the foothill woodlands. So we talked about woodlands and savannas. We talked about the oak savannas in California. So here's another picture of those. And so those all would be kind of like low elevation forests. And then, low elevation ecosystems. They're not forests. As you move up, you would move into what sometimes is called yellow pine forest. And this is really dominated by two species, either ponderosa pine or more commonly Jeffrey pine. So Jeffrey pine is a really common dominant tree species in this zone. And a lot of the forests look a lot like a ponderosa pine forest would here. We in the Rockies don't have the Jeffrey pine. It's all dominated by ponderosa pine. The next band you can see is this lodgepole / red fir forest. This is really a red fir forest, and there's some patches of lodgepole. Some people actually put lodgepole and subalpine together as different forest cover types. Lodgepole, unfortunately, gets the shaft. They're just kind of like put wherever. There's little pockets of lodgepole, much like we would have in the Rockies. And then the next forest cover type would be the subalpine forest. And so generally for us, we think about spruce fir dominating these areas. One of the differences about the Sierra Nevadas is there's really no spruce species. I mean, there are a few species that occur there, but they're fairly rare and in pockets. And so it's not really a spruce fir forest, it's more of a fir forest. And then of course above that, you've got your alpine ecosystem, some beautiful alpine areas. What's interesting then as you move down over on the east side is you have all of those same forest cover types. On the east side, they're a little higher elevation than on the west side, and that's because moisture is lower on the east side. So in order for a subalpine forest to have enough moisture, it actually has to occur at a higher elevation on the east side than the west side. So you can see they're all kind of slanted upward. But then at the lower elevations, you have different forest or different ecosystem types. So you've got pinyon juniper woodlands at low elevation and then sagebrush scrub. So we're skipping kind of those woodlands, the grasslands, and the chaparral. Those are missing on the east side and replaced by different ecosystem types on the east side of the mountain range. So I've kind of hit these things, but here's just a summary of some of those unique things that are a bit different in the Sierra Nevadas from maybe what you've learned about the Rockies. So one is just noticing the different vegetation types on the east and west side at low elevations. Again, this yellow pine forest, I think it's a term that's not used much anymore. This is really Jeffrey pine and ponderosa pine. Again, the lodgepole red fir pine, it's really red fir pine forests. And spruce are missing from their high elevation forests. Again, there's a few species there, they're just not really common. Okay, so that's a little bit about the flora of this area. Let's talk briefly about management. The issues here aren't, really different from anywhere else. I just feel like in California, they're because of the population size and the diverse interest groups, it's pretty intense in the forest management in California, and it can be intense everywhere. But I just feel like it's really extra intense in California. So some of the things that dealing with in these forested lands, one, harvesting is a big issue. Certainly there's groups there that don't want any harvesting, but historically there's been harvesting, so there are timber companies. And with human interference, some harvesting seems to be necessary. So that is a big issue, whether people are going to take trees off the landscape or not. fuels treatment and fire. I should really have fire. So today I did a search before I talked about kind of the Sierra Nevada forests and kind of management issues. And like the first 3 pages of results on Google Scholar, they were all about fire. So fire is a huge issue. It was a huge part of the ecosystem kind of dynamics historically. And of course, with human interference and population growth, fire has changed a lot. And so they're doing a lot of work to try to introduce prescribed fire and kind of those effects. Anyway, it's a huge topic. The heterogeneity in the landscape, and I put horizontal heterogeneity. So we talked in the Pacific Northwest forest about the vertical heterogeneity in the landscape. Here, the spatial heterogeneity is really large. So spatially, there's these patches of a lot of different forest cover types close together. Thinking about management, I mean, we always have recreation issues, trying to manage for timber and natural resources and conservation and recreation. But again, because of the population, the size of the population centers in California, there's a lot of recreation, a lot of demand for that. And then the other thing on top of all of this, 50% of all of California's water comes from the snow or precip, but primarily snow that falls in this mountain range. And so they really rely on this mountain range for, water supply for both agriculture and household use. So huge, like really big issues associated with the forest cover type. And then in addition to that, because of these large population centers right next to these large mountain ranges, ozone concentrations are much higher in these forested systems than other parts of the US. So there's places in the eastern US that have similar levels of ozone, but the ozone here is really, really high. And that's one thing I think we don't quite get in the Rockies. Like, we have Denver is a huge city, but like if you look at California, like the cities are all larger and there's more of them all along this mountain range. So it's an order of magnitude or several orders of magnitude kind of worse, as far as, not worse, but there's more demand on these forests and there's more pollution in these forests than anything we can really imagine here in the Rockies. So this just shows a map of the ozone. You can see these dark areas are high concentrations of ozone, which are coming from urban centers near the Sierra Nevadas. And ozone is just, it's very similar to oxygen. Oxygen is 2 oxygen molecules. Ozone is 3 oxygen molecules. So it's similar in that regard. And it has very direct impact on plant performance. So here's just a couple graphs showing this impact. The open bars are trees that were not, so this was done in the greenhouse to look at the impact of ozone on plant growth. So the open bars are plants that were grown no ozone. The shaded bars are plants grown with ozone. And you can see a decrease in photosynthesis related to ozone concentration. And as the trees got bigger, that effect got bigger in the second year of the study, and has an impact on the structure of the leaf. So this is leaf mass area, and you can see it decreases in the presence of ozone. The other thing that happens that they don't show here is that ozone just directly has a direct effect on stomatal conductance. So stomates close in the presence of ozone, and that's why we see this reduction in photosynthesis, is that stomates are closing, reducing how fast CO2 can get into the leaf to react with rubisco. So this impact of ozone is having a big impact on the growth of these forests, which then has an impact on the functions of these forest cover types as well. So ozone has been a huge issue and changing the function of these ecosystems, and kind of highlights this dynamic between these dense population centers and these forests. Okay, so that's it for the Sierra Nevadas, much shorter. And again, I kind of think about it in contrasting to things I think about in the Rocky Mountains. Again, I'm not sure why that is, except for a lot of the forest cover types are quite similar to those in the Rocky Mountains. So again, here's some questions for you to think through. There is a quiz that is posted on Canvas, so make sure you take that quiz, and it's due by next Sunday at 5. And that's all I've got for lecture this week. Hope you guys are doing well. And remember, we've got office hours. Angie and I both have office hours this week. So if you have questions about anything in the lecture or the lab activities, definitely join in on those office hours and we'll answer them at that time. Take care.